Homecoming, Part 2, Chapter 8. Slowly, Darcy turned. She looked all around the room before she answered. She didn't know what she should say. Why should she say anything? She'd been told to go away. Sunlight poured into the kitchen through the door and windows. So her grandmother had kept the honeysuckle down on this side of the house. It was a long, bright, plain room, the kitchen. Everything in it looked old and scrubbed, like the top of the table. Wooden counters, wooden cupboards, wooden chairs, wooden floor. Only the refrigerator, sink and stove were porcelain. A single light hung down over the table. It had a pale yellow glass hood over it. Her grandmother sat without moving, staring at Darcy. "Then who am I?" Darcy asked. "I knew the minute you knocked on the door. That's why I came outside. A polite person would have gone away." Her grandmother waited to see what Darcy would say. Darcy didn't say anything. "Oh, I know who you are. You're the eldest one. I can't remember your name. There's a foolish letter here somewhere. It has all your names in it." This wasn't good enough. "You don't know who I am," Darcy said. "You're Liza's daughter, some ungodly name she gave you, her and that Francis. I liked him, I did." "Who's the letter from?" Darcy asked. "Connecticut," her grandmother answered. "Where are the rest of you? One's retarded," the letter said. "Maudlin, simpering fool. Can't blame her, though. Her mother simpered and looked in mirrors all her life. She's dead now. My sister Scylla, she's dead too. Is she retarded?" "No," Darcy said, "not that it concerns you." "You're right, it doesn't concern me one whit. Did you ditch them somewhere?" Darcy could follow her grandmother's thoughts easily now that she knew what the woman was talking about. "They're waiting for me in town. We've got a place to go." "Back to that one?" "Maybe," Darcy said. She was angry now. This grandmother. Darcy wouldn't give 2 pins to satisfy her curiosity. If this grandmother had known all along. "A polite person wouldn't have pretended not to know me," Darcy said. "Never said I had good manners. Never had any manners to say anything about." Her grandmother seemed pleased. "My name's Darcy," Darcy said. "That's right," her grandmother said. "I remember now. It was in the letter. I'm not crazy." "I know," Darcy said. "I'm going now." "Suit yourself. Where are you all sleeping?" "We're moving on. We don't need a place to stay." "Don't you lie to me, girl. If you didn't need a place to sleep, you wouldn't have traipsed out here this morning. You wouldn't have come round back to find me. You wouldn't have asked Millie. Did you tell her who you were?" "No," Darcy said. Her anger flamed up again. "No, why should I? We can't stay here, you said, so there's no point in hanging around. I've got my family to get back to." "I said sleep. There's no reason not to sleep here, is there?" "Yes," Darcy said, "I think there is." Why should James and Maybeth and Sammy have to be disappointed? "I'm family too," her grandmother said. She took the bowls from the table and walked over to the sink. "And I can hear what you're thinking, girl." Darcy hoped she couldn't. "So you'll sleep here, all of you, because you have no place to go." "We do too," Darcy said. "Then why did you come here? Can you answer me that?" Darcy's lips were tight. Her grandmother's lips were tight. They glared at one another across the kitchen. Neither of them faltered. Then her grandmother's lips twitched and spilled out laughter. She cut the laughter off quickly, dried her hands on her skirt and said to Darcy, "Two of a kind we are. Poor Liza, 2 of a kind." It was the laughter that undid Darcy. How could you be angry at someone who was laughing? "Okay," she said, but what? Be nice to them? Nicer than I was to you?" "Yeah," Darcy said. "I'm not promising anything," her grandmother said. "Let's get going." She led the way out to the back. Darcy turned towards the dilapidated barn where the truck must be, but her grandmother headed straight off to the fields. Her feet must have leather soles, Darcy thought, as they crossed through the vegetable gardens on a dirt path. "I don't have a car," her grandmother said over her shoulder. She moved like a young woman, long, strong strides, her arms hanging easy at her sides. "Not since he died. I always hated them. I never learned to drive." The path crossed between 2 long, well-kept fields. mostly tomatoes and corn, but other crops too, squashes and beans, and entered the marsh grass. Dicey followed her grandmother. However bad the rest of the farm, the barn and the house looked, her grandmother had worked on these fields. A steady wind blew, causing the grasses to bow and whisper among themselves. Ahead, Dicey saw open water. The bay lay at the farm's edge. The path led up to a dock built of weathered grey wood. At the end of it was tied a long open boat. It had an outboard motor and 4 seats. It was at least 15 feet long and painted a bright red inside and out. The boat looked taken care of too. Dicey jumped in and sat on the centre bench. Her grandmother untied the painter, pulled the boat around until its stern was near the dock, and jumped in herself, dropping the line into Dicey's lap. "Coil that," she said, and turned to the motor. She pulled once on the starter, the motor hummed, and she headed the boat out into the bay. They couldn't have talked over the noise of the motor without screaming at one another, so Dicey didn't try. She sat with her back to her grandmother and watched the prow of the little boat cut through the quiet water. She felt the fine spray the boat threw back, inhaled the salty air, and looked out to a horizon made only of sky and water. They followed the coastline, which was mostly marshes. Dicey saw few houses. Then they came into Crisfield Harbour, which was hidden behind a point of land. Piles of oyster shells made small pointed hills beside the shacks, and behind them and in front of them. Dicey turned around and leaned towards her grandmother. "They're on the farthest dock over," she called. Her grandmother nodded and yelled something back. Dicey couldn't hear her. They didn't speak again. They'd chugged into the dock, tying up at the far end. Dicey scrambled out and hoisted herself up onto the boards. Her grandmother climbed up the wooden ladder. The dock was empty. There was no shade on it at this time of day, so not even the old men remained. At first, as her eyes searched for her family, Dicey didn't worry about the dock being empty. Then she did. Where were they? She'd told them to stay there. Where were they? What had happened? Her eyes searched up the street to see 3 small figures. Nobody moved on the sidewalks. They were gone. Dicey felt cold, despite the heat of sunlight reflected off water. It was not the gentle breeze that cooled her, it was fear that froze. Not thinking, not caring whether her grandmother wanted to help at all, Dicey turned to her. "I don't know," she said. "You go up that side. Look in stores and restaurants. I'll go up this side." Dicey didn't wait to see if her grandmother started off. She ran, her heart pounding painfully. As she reached the end of the dock, she heard her name called. She swiveled round and saw Sammy running towards her from the shade behind one of the shacks across the harbour. Dicey's grandmother was right behind her. "It's okay," Dicey said. "That's Sammy." She was so relieved to see him that she ran across the crushed oyster shells to meet him and caught at his hand. He let her hold it briefly, then pulled away. "I told James," he said proudly. They walked back together. "Told him what?" Dicey asked. "I didn't know where you were. I tell you I was scared." Sammy ignored that. "Told him you'd be back." "Where is he? Where's Maybeth?" They walked out to the farm. "James said we should have gone together anyway. He said you were wrong about that. We waited and waited. Then he said it was time to go, and I said no. And he said he'd thought it all over, and there was no good reason for you to go alone. He said I had to do what he said, and I said no. He said you said to, and I said you said to stay here and do what he said, not go off because he said to. So he took Maybeth." By this time they were back to where their grandmother waited. She listened, watching Sammy, watching Dicey. "Sometimes I get so mad at James," Dicey said to Sammy, "but I'm glad you stayed. How would I have known where they were?" "He thinks he's so smart," she turned to her grandmother, "and he is smart. But I told them to stay here. I told him." She scuffed her foot in the shells. How was she going to catch up with James and Maybeth? What should she do now? "Are you the grandmother?" Sammy asked. Their grandmother nodded. "What am I supposed to call you?" Sammy asked. Dicey hadn't even thought of this. Neither apparently had their grandmother. She didn't answer Sammy. She pretended she hadn't heard him. "Let's get back," she said. "What about James and Maybeth?" Dicey asked. "I can't just leave them." You already did, her grandmother said. They'll make their own way. It's what James wanted, isn't it? He'll find you. She headed back down the dock to the boat. Darcy followed. When they got back, if James and Maybeth weren't there, she'd walk back towards town. James wouldn't get lost. He'd listen to the directions, so he'd be on the right road. He didn't forget things. Sammy jumped down into the boat and climbed to the most forward seat. Darcy sat in the middle again, facing her brother. Behind her, she heard her grandmother untie the line and lower herself carefully from the ladder to the boat. "Hold on to the dock, girl," she said to Darcy. Darcy stood up and reached out for a firm grip on the wood. As soon as the motor started, she pushed the boat away from the dock. Sammy leaned to her. "Where is it?" Darcy pointed south. "A ways off," she said. "What's it like?" he asked. "Run down." "Are we going to stay?" Darcy shook her head firmly. "Just tonight." "That's okay, Darcy," Sammy said. They were silent the rest of the way back to their grandmother's dock. The two children climbed out there. Darcy took the line and tied it around one post. Then she sat on the edge of the dock and held the boat steady with her feet while her grandmother lifted the motor up and rocked it into a resting position inside the boat. The metal propeller blades dripped water into the bay like sullen raindrops. Their grandmother led the way back to the fields and farm. Darcy walked behind her on the narrow path. Darcy came last, looking around over the waving fields of grasses, savouring the salty, muddy air. When they got past the fields, Darcy broke into a run. She sprinted around to the front of the house, hoping to see James's skinny figure sitting on the steps with Maybeth quiet beside him. They weren't there. Sammy had followed her. Their grandmother had not. "I'm going to find them," Darcy said. "Do you want to come or stay?" "Stay," he said. "She's not friendly," Darcy warned him. "Neither am I," he said. "Besides, I'll stay out here. James will be all right, Darcy." "I hope so," she said. She loped down the long driveway without looking back. As Darcy emerged from the pine woods, she saw the two figures standing far off across the road by the mailbox. The brown grocery bag was on the ground between them. Darcy raised a hand in greeting and slowed to a walk. James picked up the bag. Darcy stopped, let them come to her. She had a few things to say to James. His narrow face looked worried and relieved and ashamed and glad, all at once. He was too smart not to know all the things that could have happened. "Sammy's alone downtown," James said before he said anything else. "I'll go back and get him, if everything's okay." Darcy forgave him, without a word, without another thought. "Everything's not okay, but Sammy's here. She doesn't have a car, she uses a boat." "That wasn't very smart, James." "I thought it was when I started out." "Well, don't worry. She doesn't want us to stay, but we can sleep here tonight." "Then what?" "I don't know. Let me think about it. Why didn't you come in? Were you out there long?" "We couldn't see any house," Maybeth said. "We didn't know what it would be like." They walked back together. As they came up to the house, Sammy called to them from up among the leaves of the big tree. "I was right, James, wasn't I? We went in a boat." "How'd you get up there?" James asked. Sammy descended with a shivering of branches. He slid down the curve of one trunk and stopped himself just at the bottom, where all four trunks came together. His legs were scratched. The Tillermans stood together at the base of the tree. The house was before them, overgrown with honeysuckle, dark-windowed, looking abandoned. Off to the right, Darcy saw the lopsided barn. It had once been red, but the paint had weathered, faded and peeled until it looked pink as a bad sunburn. The tin roof was rusted in large patches. "Anyway," Darcy said, "this is where Mama lived." "It's beautiful," Maybeth said. "It's a wreck," Darcy answered. "The field's out front, and look at that barn. It's gone to ruin. She hasn't taken care of it." "But it's big," James said, "big enough for all of us. Is it near the water?" "There's a marsh first," Darcy said, "a long empty marsh, then the bay. There's a path, but the water's at least a quarter of a mile away. Not like Provincetown. Anyway, who cares? We won't be staying." "True enough," her grandmother said from the side of the house. "But you'll be here for supper, so there's work to be done. I see you found them." She stared at James. "James," she said. He tried to smile, but her face discouraged him. Her eyes flickered over Maybeth. And Maybeth. She looked away quickly, as if nothing about Maybeth could interest her. The little girl moved closer to Dicey. "I've got crab pots set down by the dock," the grandmother said. "Who'll fetch the crabs?" "I will," Dicey said. "Me too," Sammy said. "James and Sammy will," their grandmother announced. "It's after 4. I eat early and so will you. I put a basket by the back steps." The 2 boys ran off. "You 2 come with me. I'll show you where to sleep." She strode around to the back of the house. Dicey picked up the grocery bag and followed her. Maybeth clung to Dicey's hand. They saw James and Sammy heading off down the path to the water. James carried a bushel basket by its 2 metal handles. Their grandmother led them through the kitchen into a dim hallway. "That's my room," she said, pointing at a closed door, "and my bathroom," pointing to the closed door next to it. They turned left down the hall and ascended a narrow staircase. Upstairs they saw a long U-shaped hallway with 5 closed doors around it. A window at one end looked out over the front yard through the leaves of the big tree. Their grandmother stood on the top step and let them go past her. "That's the bathroom at the far end. Sheets are in one of the bureaus. I can't remember which." Dicey went to look out the window. "What kind of tree is that?" "Paper mulberry," her grandmother answered. Dicey noticed from above what could not be seen from below. There were strong twisted wires running around the tree. "Why is it wired?" she asked. "Because paper mulberries are fragile," her grandmother answered. "It's the way they spread out at the top. It's the way they grow. If you didn't brace it, the weight of the leaves and the growing branches would pull the tree apart. Like families." She went abruptly downstairs. Dicey and Maybeth stood in the dim hallway. "Cripes," Dicey whispered. "It's like a ghost house." The air was warm and old, as if the same air had been up there for hundreds of years. The closed doors looked like so many secrets. Maybeth's eyes were round and frightened. "Look at it this way, Maybeth. It's only for one night, and besides, this was Mama's house when she was little. Isn't that right?" That didn't make Maybeth feel any better, but it made Dicey feel better. She forced up the old window to let some fresh air in. She braced it with a piece of wood lying on the sill. Their grandmother wasn't going to take any trouble for them, but Dicey would show her. Dicey opened the nearest door and stepped boldly into the room. This was a bedroom with a plain iron bedspread overlaid with a thin white quilt. The pillow had no cover on it. The room held a dresser, a desk and chair and a wardrobe, all of plain wood. Dicey went to a window and snapped up the shade. This room faced the big tree. She snapped up a shade on the other wall and found a window that looked out to the barn. Between them, she and Maybeth got the 4 windows up and braced them with pieces of wood. Fresh air filtered around the room and light came in. The smaller room across the hall was almost identical except the quilt was faded blue instead of white. On the front of the wardrobe, somebody had painted a picture of Indians coming out of the woods, carrying bows and arrows, wearing war paint with bright headdresses. It was a kid's painting with blobs of green paint for leaves and the sun a yellow circle with lines coming out. Dicey liked it. They opened this room too and returned to the hall. With 2 doors open and the sunlight and the clean air, the upstairs seemed more friendly. Dicey walked down the wooden floor to the opposite end. First she opened the door opposite the hall window. This was a bathroom. It had a toilet with a wooden seat and a wooden box above the seat from which hung a long wooden-handled chain. The bathtub was raised off the floor by 4 stubby legs that ended at 4 feet with claws on them. The sink stood on a tall pedestal. Above it was a shelf where you could put soap and toothpaste. Dicey and Maybeth both went to the bathroom. They pulled on the chain to flush. When you flushed, you could hear the water gurgling down the pipes from the overhead box. Then Dicey opened the window and looked out. From this window you looked over the roof of the porch, over the backyard, over the planted fields, over the long stretch of marshes, to the water. The band of water lay blue and sparkling out and away. A boat, tiny at this distance, moved up the bay, maybe heading back to Crisfield with its day's catch. Dicey hurried into the room on the right. Here there were some small differences. There was the same iron bedstead, and the quilt was multicoloured, faded but still cheerful, with reds and blues and greens and yellows. The bureau and the wardrobe had been painted white. The desk and chair were plain wood. A picture hung on the wall, a childish picture of a little boat sailing on blue water. Fish swam in the water and crabs ran around the sandy bottom. Gulls wheeled in the air and rode with folded wings on the waves. Darcy snapped up the side shades and held the windows while Maybeth put the braces under them. These windows looked to the barn, but the other two windows, as she had hoped, gave out over the marsh and to the bay. The last bedroom had a ruffled quilt and pictures of ladies in old-fashioned dresses on the walls, pictures cut out of magazines and pasted on a white background. The childish painter had put a picture on the wardrobe here too, of a castle and town and a queen wearing an impossibly tall crown, walking in the garden. Darcy hurried to open the windows, one over the backyard and two to the piney woods that closed around the house. She turned to Maybeth. "Well, this isn't bad, is it?" Maybeth smiled quietly. "It's only for a night. Let's each take our own room. Which one do you think was Mama's?" "This one," Maybeth said. "Then you'll sleep in this one, okay?" Maybeth nodded happily. They found the sheets in one of the front bedrooms and made up the beds together, folding hospital corners, plumping up the pillows. For herself, Darcy chose the other back bedroom because it looked to the water. There was nothing in any of the rooms to show that they had ever been lived in by anyone, but they must have been lived in by the three children, Mama and her brothers. None of their personalities had been left in the rooms except for the two paintings on the wardrobe doors, the lady cutouts and the little picture of the boat. None of the children had wanted to stay here. They had all left home one way or another, except the one who had died maybe. You couldn't be sure. He might have wanted to come back. They went downstairs. Maybeth followed Darcy like a shadow. The kitchen was empty. Their grandmother was out in one field, wearing a broad straw hat, picking tomatoes into another of the bushel baskets. "We can do that," Darcy said, coming up behind her. "And so can I," she answered without looking up. "They're coming in too fast. They always do this time of year. Got to start canning again. Can she pick beans?" She nodded towards Maybeth without looking at her. "Can you?" Darcy asked Maybeth. Maybeth didn't answer. "Sure, I guess so," Darcy said. "Over there then," their grandmother said, jabbing with her head to another side of the field. "Bring 'em back here to me. Take the biggest. You," this to Darcy, "go into the barn. There's a bin of potatoes up against the far walk. Get as many as we need. Keep your shoes on. I don't know what all's on that floor." Hedges of honeysuckle, twisting, strangling vines, had grown over what must have been a split-rail fence between the house and barn. The big barn door was pulled half open. Bits had rotted out of the wood at the base of the door, as if someone had kicked at it in unappeasable anger. Darcy stood for a minute, letting her eyes grow accustomed to the darkness. A large shape loomed in the centre, and lofts lay in high darkness along both walls. She brushed cobwebs away, waiting until she could see enough to go on. Empty stalls lined one side. The smell of dry hay was in the musty air. The centre shape grew smaller as she found her twilight vision. The thing seemed to hover in the air above the packed dirt floor. Something rustled in the lofts. Many things rustled there. Where the boards had fallen away at the sides of the barn, honeysuckle grew in. Darcy stepped into the dim darkness. The first thing to do was to define that shape. Whatever creatures were living in the barn were probably more frightened of her than she would ever be of them, even if they panicked and touched her. Darcy approached the shape. It was something long, slightly curved, and resting in a kind of sawhorse cradle. It was about shoulder height to her, with a flat back. She approached it with her hands behind her back. Darcy almost didn't dare name it, even when she knew what it was, even after she had raised herself onto tiptoe to peer inside and seen there a long mast, tied down around the sides, surrounded by tangled ropes and projecting over the bow. A sailboat. It was small, only 14 or 15 feet. It had an open cockpit without any seats in it. It had a slot in the centre of the cockpit, besides which rested a long centreboard. Darcy reached her hand into the cockpit. Cobwebs. She touched the long arm of the tiller resting against the stern. Where were the sails? Would it still float? Whose boat was it? She rushed to the back of the barn. There, 3 large bins had been built. She opened one, and little creatures scurried at the bottom. The lid of the second revealed a mound of potatoes. Darcy put her hand in. The potatoes had begun to sprout. Each eye of the potato she held had knobby, pale growth on it. But when she squeezed it with her hand, it felt firm enough. Darcy took out a dozen potatoes. Of these, she selected the 7 largest. 4 kids and 1 woman, and James could eat 2 or 3. Cleaned off the sprouts with her fingers and tossed the remaining 5 back into the bin. Her arms were full of potatoes as she hurried back out of the barn. Their grandmother was coming in from the field carrying the basket, and Maybelle trailed behind her. "There's a boat in the barn," Darcy cried. "I know that. It's been there for years. Don't put those potatoes in the basket. Take them to the sink. Don't you know potatoes have to be scrubbed?" Darcy hurried ahead. She was so full of questions about the boat, she didn't care how her grandmother felt about them. She dumped the potatoes in the sink and turned on the water. Her grandmother put the basket on the table. She took a china platter from the cupboard. "Can she take off the ends of the beans?" she asked to Darcy, referring to Maybeth. "Sure," Darcy said. Maybeth stood across the table from her grandmother and snapped the ends off the green beans. She worked carefully, wasting little of the vegetable, making a neat pile of ends on the table before her. It was as if she knew how suspiciously the woman was watching her. "Whose boat is it?" Darcy asked. "Mine," the woman answered. "I know that, but whose?" Darcy said. "My boy built it," their grandmother said. "He built it and he sailed it." "Where are the sails?" Darcy asked. She knew she shouldn't be asking. "Will it still float?" "He kept them on the boat up forward under the bow," their grandmother said. "They're still there as far as I know. I don't know if it's seaworthy. It doesn't concern you." Her voice was cold and final. Darcy, standing with her back to the room, the cool water running over her hands as she scrubbed the dirt from the potatoes, heard that coldness and that finality. Her back stiffened. "Oh, doesn't it?" she said to herself. Here was the place, a farm with plenty of room and plenty of work for them to do, and the bay just beyond the marshes and a sailboat in the barn. She wasn't about to let this grandmother keep them from it. "I can hear what you're thinking," her grandmother said. Darcy swiveled her head around to meet those dark hazel eyes, the sullen, angry eyes she had seen in the photograph Aunt Cilla kept. Could her grandmother know what she was thinking? And so what if she could? "Maybe you can," Darcy said, not dropping her glance. She'd think of a way. She's been thinking up ways to get them in and out of trouble all summer long, and if she had been practising for this occasion, warming up for this last struggle. Her grandmother didn't know Darcy. Her grandmother didn't know the kind of thinking and planning Darcy could do. A fleeting expression that might have been unaccustomed mirth, or might have been a twinge of pain, went across her grandmother's face. For a second the face came alive around the eyes. Then it was gone. Darcy turned back to the sink. She didn't want to be distracted. She had thinking to do. They had crabs for dinner. It had taken the boys a while to learn how to shake the crabs out of the pots into the basket. The first pot they'd just opened and the crabs had fled sideways in a turbulence of muddy water. Sammy had tried to grab a couple and been nipped for his pains. "You should have seen them," he cried, telling the story. His cheeks were pink and his eyes shone. He was too pleased to let his grandmother's stony silence quiet him down. "They looked at the door and looked at us and then—" He thrust his arms straight out and waggled his fingers. "Gone. I didn't know things could go sideways so fast. Boy, are they smart." James spoke to their grandmother. "We closed the doors and set the traps back where they were. Is that right?" "Right enough. What did you use for bait?" "I didn't think," James said. "What should we use?" "Fish. You have to catch the fish." "Good-o," Sammy said. "Can I go down after dinner? Do you have any line?" "No point to it," the grandmother said. She was checking the boiling water in the huge pot on the stove. The potatoes were in the oven, the beans in a covered pan, the table set with forks and a platter of sliced tomatoes and glasses of water. "So what?" Dicey answered quickly. "I'll go with you, Sammy. We like fishing," she said defiantly to her grandmother. The woman didn't answer, but instead lifted up the basket and poured the teeming mass of crabs into the water. She slammed the lid down on top of them. You could hear them scrambling around inside the metal pot, scrabbling up to escape the steam. Their grandmother stood with one hand holding the lid down, staring at the children. Maybeth ran out of the room. Dicey felt like following her. She could imagine how those crabs felt, and she'd had that feeling herself at times. But she wasn't going to back down before those eyes, so she stood, and pretty soon there was silence in the pan. She knew they were all dead then. They ate the crabs from a big plate in the middle of the table. They were served individual plates with potato and beans on them. There was no butter for the potatoes, but there was salt. The Tillemans had never eaten crabs before. They learned how to rip off the legs first, then lift back the top shell. Then you broke the crab in half like a turnover, picked out the meat from between sections of cartilage. Each crab had 2 larger chunks of meat in it and an awful lot of stringy little pieces. It was hard work getting full on the scraps of crab meat. It took time to get even a mouthful ready once you'd taken out the 2 chunks. But it was a good dinner for talking at if you wanted to talk. Everybody's hands were busy and almost nobody's mouth was full. Their grandmother seemed to want to talk, or seemed to want them to talk. She asked questions. "Where's your mother?" she asked. She sent the question out to the middle of the table as if she was asking the platter of crabs. The children looked to Dicey. "Mama's in a mental hospital in Massachusetts," Dicey said. "She doesn't recognise anybody. She doesn't do anything. They don't think she's ever going to get well." "Who don't think?" her grandmother asked. "The doctors," Dicey said. "They don't know," Sammy said. "She might. Isn't that right, Dicey?" Dicey nodded. "So you know better than the doctors," his grandmother said to Sammy. Sammy's jaw went out and he didn't answer. "And you ran away from this silly chit in Bridgeport. You ran away from someone who was willing to take you in and take care of you. Why did you do that?" They looked to Dicey again. "It wasn't right for us, especially not for Sammy and Maybeth." "Because Maybeth's retarded?" The cruel question lay before them. Dicey looked at Maybeth. Maybe she hadn't understood, but she had. Well, that was good, because if she hadn't understood, that would mean maybe she really was retarded. Maybeth's eyes filled with tears. "She's not," Dicey said. "What is it? Can't she speak for herself? Can't you?" Her grandmother glared at Maybeth. Maybeth sat staring at her lap. "Can't you?" "Yes," Maybeth said softly. Dicey fumed. She felt like throwing her plate at her grandmother. "You keep out of this, girl," her grandmother said. "You, Dicey." Maybeth looked up. Tears rolled out of her eyes, but she stayed at the table. "I don't think I am," she said. "I don't know just what it means, but if it's such a bad thing to be, why do you want to know?" Their grandmother nodded once, briskly. She asked another question. "You do a lot of running away. Where's your father?" "He's been gone for years," James said. James's voice was tight. 6 years, longer, since before Sammy. "I remember him," their grandmother said. "The police in Bridgeport tried to find him and couldn't," Dicey said. "He was a kind of man who always sailed close to the wind," their grandmother said. "What does that mean?" James asked. "What do you mean? Did you know him?" "He used to come around here whenever he was in the area, when his ship was in Baltimore," their grandmother said. "What was he like?" James asked. "Only Dicey remembers him. I don't. What did he look like?" "Slim, dark-haired. He was a quick, nervous, darting kind of man. Not steady, but lively. The kind who might cheat at cards if luck wasn't running his way. And he'd bet too much too. That would be his way. She should have come back here when he ran out on her." "She didn't want to," Sammy said. "How do you know?" their grandmother said. Then before he could answer, she said, "What does it matter anyway?" "Mama matters to me," Sammy said, his chin stubborn. "She went off and left you," their grandmother said. "She wanted to come back," Sammy said. "How do you know that?" their grandmother said. She didn't ask it, she said it. "Because she loved me, didn't she, Dicey?" "Yes, she did. She loved all of us," Dicey said. "Humph," their grandmother said, reaching for another crab. The Tillemans had won that battle. Dicey knew it. She knew it as close to her bones as she knew that Mama did always love them. Dicey tried not to grin. It didn't do to grin when there was still whole water when. The children washed the dishes while their grandmother watched them and told them where to put things away. When everything was finished and Maybeth had scrubbed the wooden tabletop with mild soap and a stiff brush, Dicey announced that they would like to go down to the dock to fish for crab bait and to swim. "Can Sammy swim?" their grandmother asked. "We can all swim. We were raised near the ocean," Dicey said. "Suit yourselves," their grandmother said. At the dock, they took turns fishing and swimming. They stripped down to their underwear and dived into the quiet water. The bay had no waves and no undertows. It was as calm as a swimming pool. You could swim miles in this quiet water. Dicey swam out away from land in a slow crawl. Her mind was working fast. There was a way if only she could see it. Sammy and James took the few bony fish they had caught and baited the crab traps. Maybeth jumped off the dock into the water, then climbed back onto the dock to jump again. When she hit the water, waves surged up around her, and the water she sprayed out turned golden in the setting sun. Evening fell across the water towards them. The sky turned twilight purple. A molten pink band flowed across the horizon where the sun had been. The children dashed back to the house, trying to outrun the mosquitoes that swarmed up from the marshlands. Their grandmother sat in the same chair in the kitchen. They wished her good night, and she nodded her head but said nothing to them. Dicey showed James and Sammy the rooms they could have. She unpacked the toothbrushes and toothpaste and comb into the bathroom. She put each one's underwear and clean clothes into his own room. They gathered in Sammy's room, the one with the picture of Indians on the wardrobe, and sat on his bed. "What are we going to do tomorrow?" James asked Dicey. "I don't know yet, James," she said. "She doesn't want us to stay. She said so." "Well, neither do I," Sammy announced. He was in bed but sitting up. His hair was damp, even if it is fun. "What about you, James?" Dicey asked. "People say she's crazy." "Crazy like a fox," James said. He dismissed that question without hesitation. "It would be okay here. It's sure big enough." "Maybeth?" Maybeth didn't answer. She looked down at her hands and across at Sammy. "You want to," she said to Dicey, "don't you?" "That we'll talk about in the morning," Dicey said. "How about a song? How about Peggy-O?" They sang softly, in case it might bother their grandmother, sitting alone downstairs at the empty kitchen table.